Craig Dempsey is a seasoned business professional in Latin American affairs. He is the managing director and co-founder of Biz Latin Hub Group that specializes in the provision, market, entry, and back office services. Craig holds a degree in mechanical engineering with honors and a master's degree in project management from the University of New South Wales. Craig is also a military veteran, having served in the Australian Army on numerous overseas missions, and also he is a former mining executive with experience in various overseas jurisdictions, including, among others, Canada, Australia, Peru, and Colombia. And Aqui Ahora, we have with us Craig Dempsey, and he will have a conversation with the managing partner and founder of PAG.law, the experts in technology business in Latin America, and the sponsors of Aqui Ahora, this podcast. With you, Craig Dempsey and Juan Pablo Cappello.
Craig, thanks for joining us.
No, look, absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good. Hey, you're one of these people I actually read about before I ever heard about, in the sense that, I saw that in the spring, or maybe before, but I became aware that you began publishing articles in Forbes. And it looks like, sort of on a monthly basis, but, just very sort of practical, 5 legal tips for propelling your startup's growth in LATAM, how to protect your brand development with trademarks. And what I liked about it was I could definitely tell you were sort of coming to it. Latin America is fairly peculiar. I started my career working as a lawyer in Chile before I came to the States. And so, I've had a pretty clear sense of, a lot of times when, non-US founders or even VC firms begin looking around LATAM, there's a bunch of issues that, they aren't very sensitive to. So tell us about a little bit literally your journey to Latin America and what got you writing these articles.
Sure, not a problem. Look, I'm Australian, so obviously I'm a long way from home. Originally, I actually left school and went and joined the army, actually.
Uh-huh.
So I went through a military academy in Australia, found myself in Australia serving as well as various places around the world. After sort of finishing up in the military after 11 years in the Vietnam service, I ended up moving and working in mining of all random things, but fairly large sector in Australia.
Right, of course.
And then look, after that, I actually resigned after a couple of years, and the company I was working with at the time said, "Look, we've actually got an opportunity in Canada. It's a short-term thing, but look, if you want to give it a go, off you go." So I was one of those situations where I went across as part of an integration team that bought a very large project there, or various projects. And by default, being, I guess, the 4th or 5th most senior person of this team, everyone else above me actually pulled out. So I found myself by default running the operations in Canada. So that took me for a while there. I realized that I don't like the cold weather. I happened to be at dinner one night. It was raining a lot. I was in the city of Vancouver, which rains about 200 days a year. And a gentleman there.
Very green. It's very green.
It's beautiful and it's great in the summer. I highly recommend it in the summer. But otherwise, it just wasn't for me. And look, someone offered me a job in Latin America. So more or less, I hopped on a plane, flew to Latin America, didn't know any of Spanish, never been here before, took the job. And I guess about 6 or 7 years later, I find myself now living in Colombia with my own business or various businesses. And yeah, so that's sort of what brought me down here, as much as random luck, bad weather from Canada, and I guess, a few, good signs on the way that sort of took me here.
No, that's amazing. And I don't know about all your businesses, but one of your businesses, from what I understand, is really about helping. This is the Biz Latin Hub Group that helps, I guess, companies launch into other markets. In Latin America, is your target, from what I could tell, sort of companies that are interested in growing into Latin America? Is that who your sort of focus is? How does that work?
Sure. Yes. I mean, the group itself, I guess, is my primary focus. Although, as I said, I have a few other interests. The Biz Latin Hub Group fundamentally is the marriage of a law firm meets an accounting firm, I guess, with a bit of consulting on the side. So we have offices now across 16 countries, and we hopefully should get around 20 before year's end, is where at this stage what we're sort of, I guess, projecting. More or less, we work with foreign clients, although there are exceptions to this, and particularly those from North America, Europe, and they're usually mid to large size companies that are looking to either establish a presence within the region, so they're looking support in regards to where to establish, how to navigate the complexities of the local environment, everything from legal, from accounting, taxation, but also culturally and practical, all those sorts of aspects. So we work a lot in that sort of realm. Conversely, we do also operate, with, I guess, the high net worth individual or the smaller startup that wants to enter into a new market. Yes, we do work with them as well. However, we're more specialized on working with those clients that want to work on a multi sort of country sort of basis. So we often plug into a lot of global arrangements and alliances and things, sort of operating as their Latin American arm. Although more recently we have opened very small offices in Australia and New Zealand. I think at least for the foreseeable future, we'll sort of focus on this region.
You mean, okay, so you guys will focus, so your inbound clients are coming from all over the world?
That is correct.
And where your focus is Latin America. What do you, when you sit down with somebody who's, less experienced with Latin America, and they're talking about, they want to charge into the region. Is their focus generally, Brazil, Mexico, which are the two big prizes? Do you often lay out a strategy that, hey, some of these smaller markets are perhaps less competitive or, smaller scale to learn before you go into those bigger markets that, if you make a mistake, it might be a $10 million mistake as opposed to $1 million mistake in terms of scale. How do you help clients think about those kinds of issues?
Sure, and you've grasped it straight away. Look, going back at least 10 years ago, anyway, or more the cliche, if you want to enter Latin America, you would establish a presence in Brazil because you have a large market in itself. And then on the Spanish side, which is quite different to, I guess, the Portuguese side of Brazil, you would then pick Mexico. It's a larger Spanish market, and therefore you can basically operate within both. That is a pretty common business model.
And it represents something like 65% of the purchasing power of Latin America.
It does a lot. However, it really depends on what you're looking to do is
right.
A practical thing, because whilst it represents 60, 50, 70%, whatever it is, it depends on what you're selling, whether that's actually a true reflection of what you're doing. And also to be mindful, those markets, although, in Latin America, are quite competitive markets and are quite saturated across many sectors. So in some respects, there are more opportunities entering perhaps a second tier simply from a size point of view, maybe entering a Colombia, an Argentina, a Chile. And in many ways, particularly those from North America, what's very common these days is, I guess more recently with obviously the current government in the US, where visas are more difficult, a lot of people in the North America are going, look, many years ago, we would look towards India or somewhere else to get tech people, etc., to complement whatever we're doing in the US. A lot of them nowadays are saying, look, actually, we would prefer to go to Latin America. Latinos are culturally, more accepted or very well accepted in the US. They're in the same time zone, etc. So the only thing that usually holds that back is language. But what you find, particularly in Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, these economies actually do have a lot, very, very good education systems comparatively. So you actually find a lot of, particularly good tech talent in those sorts of areas. So if you're a tech business looking to establish here for, I guess, an arms and legs capacity, you'd probably look towards those jurisdictions. You wouldn't look at Mexico or Brazil. If you're looking to sell a commodity, yes, you might look at those larger markets. Conversely, another one off the top of my head is, a very large e-cigarette or couple, actually, we've been approached over the years. They want to get into the market. And actually, based on the regulatory system, it's actually a lot of the smaller countries, such as your Guatemalas, your El Salvadors, actually offer a better value proposition for them than the larger economies.
Yeah, you just actually touched on a really interesting point I hadn't thought about, which is a regulatory point. That, one of the big problems like doing business in Brazil is if you ask 3 lawyers at leading firms the same question, you often get 3 sometimes surprisingly different answers. Chile, Uruguay, for instance, are known as being, from a business perspective, a rule of law, rule of contract kind of perspective, better. And so, I imagine, as you point out, the regulatory impact in these countries is definitely something your clients have to think about.
Yeah, look, the regulatory environment, more so when I say regulatory environment, is more the taxation environment is the most difficult thing for clients to understand and operate within. A simple thing, regardless of the fact that you have various trade agreements across the region, it's very difficult establishing a company or an entity in one country and then trying to operate across the region. It's very difficult.
Right.
You almost have to operate every individual country in itself. That's a common thing. Also explaining the concept, which is very, very common in Latin America, and I guess even tracing back to Spain and Portugal, etc. The concept of what is a legal representative of an entity or what is a notary. A lot of these very things that are taken for granted in this part of the world don't exist in
right.
the US, Australia, etc. So we do spend a lot of time explaining these things, and obviously you get to somewhere like Brazil. Realistically, every state in itself almost has its own taxation system, even far more than what the US is. So it is very difficult at times. However, at the end of the day, a lot of those barriers to enter, which makes it difficult, also means your competition has those same barriers to enter. So once you're established in the market, you actually have a pretty good opportunity to, I guess, take advantage of that before competition can, I guess, get in there as well.
And what markets, as you said, 10 years ago, it would just sort of be, let's go for the big prizes. That's become more nuanced. People taking into account, the competitiveness of the market, the regulatory environment, the tax environment. So, what markets do you think are, obviously, with the government in Argentina, I think Argentina is not at the top of most people's list today. But what markets sort of are? Every market, it's interesting. It feels like almost every market in Latin America is having issues. In Chile, we started in October with some social protests, and obviously with COVID, it's only added fuel to that fire in terms of inequality. But you're obviously in Colombia. That's been, on the tech side, which is really, my world, been a big focus the last few years. But what markets are you seeing? Colombia and other places?
Yeah, look, as you sort of indicated in your question there, inequality across the region is a problem.
Yeah.
There'll always be a level of instability, and obviously that varies depending across the countries. You have some that are far more socially equitable, so to speak, compared to other jurisdictions. And obviously COVID-19 really hasn't helped. However, realistically, in many ways, the reaction of the individual governments themselves has either helped or hindered their situation. As you would know, probably Uruguay, is even considered by the EU about being one of the countries that have really managed to take control of the situation. The same as Paraguay. Costa Rica is another example as well. In regards to opportunities in the region, you've got the big outliers of Brazil and Mexico. At the end of the day, Brazil is always going to be a big economy, and therefore it's always going to be attractive, even though it's got a lot of complexity. Mexico sits on the border with the US, arguably the largest or the most dynamic economy in the world, and therefore it's always going to do okay. But what other ones are there of interest? I always come down to, I always think Peru is very underrated.
Yeah.
Peru itself, whilst it's not quite one of the biggest ones, you sort of have Argentina, Chile, and sort of Colombia, which sort of get a bit more spotlight than Peru. One of the good things about Peru, or a couple actually, is the legal system and regulatory system is relatively good. And actually has a number of things that make, particularly for smaller companies, a little bit cheaper to operate than perhaps in some of those other jurisdictions. And also the market, whilst also not enormous, is very, very concentrated in one city, the capital, which is on the water. So if you want to sell a product in Peru, you basically just have to get it to the port, and then you can sell to half the country in one city, which makes it a lot easier to get route to access to market than perhaps going to somewhere like Colombia, where you landed on one coast and there's actually two different coasts, and then you have to try to work out how to truck it into the mountains to get to the capital city. There's a lot of different complexity compared to somewhere like Peru. So I think Peru's an interesting one.
What is interesting with my podcast is that some of my talks with entrepreneurs and people based in Peru, the downloads have been off the charts. I would have just never expected. A little bit like you said, Peru's been interesting market. Culturally, Chile and Peru have always, had a little bit of tension. But yeah, I've been amazed actually sort of by the interest that, Peru sort of, inherently seems to create. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting economy. I guess this is good or bad, depending on how you want to look at it. But a number of countries in Latin America have been very good at promoting themselves. And the reality in some cases is they're perhaps better at promoting than the reality, and vice versa. And I would just say over the years, Peru probably hasn't done a fantastic job of promoting itself outside of food and Machu Picchu. It's not really known for much else.
Yeah.
Whereas, in regards to establishing an entity, depending on what you want to do, and obviously, the labor market and things aren't enormous, but depending on the type of business you want to do, it actually can be a very good option. And security and things are quite good. In many ways, people do consider Peru what Chile used to be before it became more expensive and more developed. I mean, there was a trend going back more about 5-6 years ago where a lot of companies were sort of picking up from Santiago and relocating either part or all their workforce into Lima, just on the fact that there were these advantages, it was a bit cheaper, things that are getting a little bit more dynamic there. And obviously Argentina is complicated, to say the least.
And I have a quick question. In the United States, there are tech companies that will launch in New Zealand just as a beta market, sort of thinking it's small, manageable relative to the U.S. market, fine-tune their product, and then go into the United States. I know you mentioned Uruguay. I've talked to some people over the years who've sort of, posited Uruguay as that sort of beta market for Latin America. And what's your view? I mean, obviously it's a tiny market. It's 2.5 million people.
Well, the good thing about Uruguay is it's an above average rich country for the region.
Right.
It has a fairly concentrated population that's fairly educated. So the good thing about Uruguay itself, it is quite indicative of, I would say, rich Latin America across all the other countries. So at the end of the day, whilst it's only 2.5 million in Uruguay, you can say, the middle class itself maybe makes up 1.5 million of that.
Yeah.
Which, if you go to some of the larger cities in perhaps the countries that have some problems in regards to distribution of wealth, 1.5 million is actually pretty reflective of some of those mid-tier larger cities. So
it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Uruguay's middle class is an outlier in terms of how large it is relative to the population.
Yeah, so you'll probably find that Uruguay itself, which obviously promotes itself, and they have a number of tech hubs and centers of excellence and all the variety of different things there. And they're also quite active, actually, their embassies and things across the region promoting themselves. They are quite a good way of measuring how a product or service will market within the LATAM region at the sort of middle class level. So if you're introducing a product, an app, or something that you're targeting that market, it can actually be quite a good way to enter. If you're looking for a broader spectrum of everybody, then perhaps it's not your best market to choose. You might want to get something more reflective. So it really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to sell, which is why I was saying before, Brazil and Mexico are fantastic if you're trying to sell something to everybody.
Right.
But if you're trying to sell something more selective, it may not be the right fit.
And what I liked about, as I got to read your articles, is they're quite actionable in terms of the advice you give. Yeah, what are the sort of tips that you make sure that you give at that first meeting with almost every client who's beginning to think about this region? They've been successful elsewhere in the world, and as they're sort of thinking through a strategy, they come to talk to somebody like you all in order to allow them to better roll out in multiple jurisdictions.
Sure. And look, most of the people approach us, whether they're an individual or whether they're representing a large multinational, Boeing, or whatever the different companies, usually they come, they've done business before, they know how more or less things work. So to be fair, that's fairly bread and butter going through how the formalities of the system work. So usually, I guess when I'm involved, I will normally talk about things that aren't so obvious. And what are some things?
Right.
And some of this is, I guess, particularly for yourself, it's pretty damn obvious. But one of the things I say is just because everybody in the region, excluding Brazil, speaks Spanish, don't think they're all the same. The realities of Mexican is very different to a Colombian, who's different to a Peruvian, who's different to an Argentine. So, it's one of the easy things to say, well, they all speak Spanish, therefore they're all going to be the same. So that's one thing I always point out. And along those lines, it's the same thing of just because a notary, which is sort of a governmental shop or governmental, office in Mexico, operates very different to how a notary operates in Chile. So basically one of the first things I always tell them is, look, just don't assume.
Right.
Don't assume. Otherwise, you'll just get yourself into some problems. I guess the second thing I always talk to them about, and this is more focused on, small entrepreneurs and those sorts of things. The reality is I always tell them that the first thing you should do is make sure you understand your business model. I see this a lot, is someone comes into the market, whichever country, they actually do, they invest their money, they do everything right, they create a successful business. But the reality is, even when they're successful, they still make no money, just because at the end of the day, in that sector, with their business model, it's just not going to be profitable. And there's nothing more frustrating when you see somebody who's really, really working hard, but at the end of the day, they're making $1,000 a month, or something trivial, just on the fact that it doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to make any more. So I always tell people that, really understand what your business model is. And if you are successful, make sure you're going to actually get the rewards of that. There's no point in doing a business really, really well, because you could do a different business really, really well and actually, get more reward from it. So that's also something I always point out to people, because it's always a bit disheartening when you see people go through that. And I guess the last thing in this, the LATAM system, the Latin American system in general, dates itself back, particularly the Spanish side, back to the Spanish, and for Brazil, back to the Portuguese. It's not built on trust. The system itself is not built on trust. So unlike, I signed a document for the UK today, I printed the document, signed it, took a scan, sent it back to them. It's all good. It's considered I've signed that document. With someone like Latin America, that doesn't work.
Right.
If I'm going to sign a document, I have to go to a governmental office and sign it in person. Often I'll have to take a fingerprint and actually put that on. I may have to take an eye scan. There's going to be various things or steps in the process, because it's built on either a bureaucracy or realistically on trust doesn't exist. Therefore, you positively have to do additional things. So that's sort of within the entire system itself, which does slow it down. What it means is a lot more documents, things need to be done in hard copy, they need to be physically mailed. You need to do through processes where a apostille or legalization, so you can use them between jurisdictions, etc. So it's very important someone's going to operate in this region, they do understand that. Otherwise, quite frankly, you will just get frustrated by the bureaucracy and pretty much leave when you realize that you can't actually sign anything. You almost have to make a weekly visit to a governmental office to actually do your signatures, etc. And it goes the same thing to banking and everything else.
No, I mean, I was actually just thinking about how you were saying that point that, in Latin America, culturally, we're so different. I think it's funny. I realize I used to always make that point, and I haven't lately. And I think I need to start making it again, because it's such an obvious point. But if you're not from the region, you're just not sensitive to it. One thing I thought was interesting the other day, Nicholas Luxtig from Magna Partners, the fund, and they have they also launched LATAM List, which is a great source for information. He sent he put out a tweet sort of saying, who's building remote infrastructure for people to be able to live in Latin America and work for U.S. companies? I want to invest in your company. He was literally like what I love when venture capitalists sort of say to entrepreneurs, like, throw down the gauntlet, like, build this company and I will fund it. Are you seeing any, sort of opportunities? I mean, obviously with COVID, companies like Twitter and Facebook have announced, that they're basically giving up a lot of their office space, and a lot of their employees are going to go remote. For instance, I have a daughter now who's living in San Francisco, who's paying $3,000 a month for a 300 square foot, 30-meter apartment. And yeah, part of me is thinking, Jesus, she literally goes into work once every 2 weeks. I mean, she could be commuting from a ski resort in Lake Tahoe, for instance, or she could be living in Colorado or in some place with a much lower cost of living, if she so chose. How do you think Latin America, can fit into that equation in terms of remote work? You mentioned, companies that maybe were hiring developer talent in Eastern Europe or India. Many have began, because of time zone issues, et cetera, began working with teams in LATAM. I mean, how do you see that in terms of, Latin America repositioning itself?
Yeah, no, look, it's a great question. And, how did it all start? I guess realistically, Latin America, I guess the connection particularly with North America is, people particularly from Canada and the US got cold. So, basically they come visit for a vacation in Latin America. They kind of liked it, went back and said, it's not such a bad place. And then you had a number of those people there, well, actually, I'm going to retire and I'm going to live down in Latin America, at least during the summer, and from there I'll build a house and I'll trade on the stock market or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of got to the next evolution. People are going, well, no, actually, I'm going to go visit Latin America, or I'm going to do some work from down there. And now you have the next step where companies are saying, well, actually, why don't we just hire people from Latin America that can work for a US company? So it's becoming more and more. It's becoming quite common. And particularly in those countries which have a high prevalence of technology or technology training, particularly developers, back-end, front-end, etc., and they have a high level of English. As you would know yourself, once again, not generalizing, some countries in the region have a relatively good level of English, I guess the population. Some countries have quite poor, and you won't find many people at all. So it's one of the key things holding back this sort of model across the region, and why it won't be even in regards to who gets to take advantage of it. It's one of the things.
You mentioned that there's actually, it's sort of a sad situation, but super interesting. I've read a number of articles about, people in Mexico who lived in the United States as kids, and then when their parents were deported or, had immigration issues, they went home. And one, culturally, how hard it is, right? When you've actually, you're 15 years old, you might have lived in a, Mexican American neighborhood in Los Angeles or whatever. That's very different than going back to DF, right? Or Guadalajara. And how, these people, initially would just get hired at call centers, but now, because of their cultural connection, et cetera, with the United States, they're able to, figure out ways to work remotely. And these articles were being written before COVID. I mean, it seems, again, after COVID, if somebody's, going to suddenly have 500 employees working remotely, those employees don't have to be all living within 45 minutes of the office. They can literally be almost anywhere as long as there's a good internet connection. And, Latin America has that.
Yeah, look, least most of capital C's have pretty good internet connection. But look, I've always I ponder this question right now. As I said, at the moment, most of my offices are working remotely at the moment, or at some sort of transition between the offices. And look, in principle, it's actually worked very, very well. But before this time, only one office, which was Mexico City, did we have a 1 day a week working from home policy, where the rest of it we did.
Oh, okay.
And it works very effectively now. But I do wonder, and this is sort of, I guess, more of a general, even outside of Latin America, whilst it works very effective now, in part, there are a lot less distractions for people right now because there are bars, cinemas, brands and things, etc. So people don't have much else to do. So being at home and working seems to work quite well. I do wonder in normal times whether that does apply for the average person. Of course, there are those highly self-motivated people who always make it work. But for your average person, I'm not quite sure. But I know recently in my Bogota office, we've more or less returned to the office, at least in some state. And in general, most people are very, very happy with that because they miss that social connection of an office environment. So I do think that even Latin America or the rest of the world, there will still be a place for offices. At the end of the day, there is important for the exchange of ideas and things that can only be done in person, as well as relationships, etc. But working also remotely, I think, is definitely going to be on the trend, particularly looking at those sorts of regions like down here, which are cheaper in regards to hiring labor, particularly for a lot of things that you're looking for. So I do suspect they'll be looking even more down to this part of the world, but they will also, I guess, temper that by having an office in this part of the world as well, where there is some sort of interaction, connection between those people, and sort of almost a satellite office from their parent.
And when you look out over the next 5 years, what do you think are the sort of the big trends you're going to be seeing in terms of companies, non-Latin companies or Latin companies rolling out throughout the region? What do you've been at this for quite a while. You've seen, as you said, sort of trends come and go. You mentioned 10 years ago, it was really all about, Mexico and Brazil. Now, that has become more nuanced in terms of, thinking about the product you're selling, your business model, and where the opportunities are. Yeah, what do you think, in terms of those trends as the market evolves as we come out of this quarantine?
Look, what's going to happen over the next 5 years in Latin America? Look, the reality is, Latin America itself, still the middle class, might be 30%, if you're lucky across the region. So over the next 5 years, the next 20, 50 years, you're going to see and hopefully see, a gradually increasing of the middle class, which means those people in the middle class are going to want all the things that someone sitting in, Florida or Boston, whatever, takes for granted.
Right.
So what you're going to see, like you are now, you're going to see more of those things that make life easier, you're accustomed to in the US, come down this part of the world. Whether that's, from fast food, which it will become more prevalent, which may not necessarily be a good thing, but it's going to happen. The same thing of, making orders online. At the moment, for example, in Colombia, Amazon basically doesn't exist. There is a kind of equivalent, etc., Mercado Libre, but, it's quite difficult and it's quite expensive to get something. So you'll find that sort of stuff. So about those sort of products and services that make life easier, you will find pretty much take from US or from Europe or whatever, brought to Latin America. You're going to see a lot more of that. Another one that I guess we will see moving forward, and I guess this is linked to that, but the banking system, the financial technology system in Latin America is very difficult. Okay, whether that means you get an interest rate and you're paying 2%, that's per month, or whether you're trying to get open a bank account and it takes you weeks, or you're trying to move money from here to there and it's costing you money, whether there's deposit taxes, you will find the entire...
just an anecdote. So, at Patagon, the company I was a partner at, we tried to be the sort of the first online bank in the region, and failed miserably, but we still sold the company, for $700 million to Santander. What's funny was I was living in Chile at the time. I had been in the private bank at Citibank in New York City before I'd gone back to Chile. I moved back to Chile, and Citibank Chile won't open my account because I did not qualify as a customer because I didn't have a high school degree from a school in Chile. I mean, just to give you an idea, like just how silly that those kinds of things that you, as you say, completely take for granted.
No, I can give you
reality in Latin.
Look, for example, if you're you can't open in most countries in Latin America. If you're a foreigner, regardless if you're here, if you don't have a certain ID, you can't open a bank account. And let's just say you do get that bank account open. You find a lot of countries actually won't allow you to send money out of the country from your bank account for the first year. So, alternatively, we have one of our clients right now. They managed to open their account here, which is great, and they operate in the mining sector. But this client's not allowed to send money from abroad into their account. So if you have a business that you set up locally, how do you fund your business if you can't send money into the country? These are just practical things.
Right.
But I will say, but conversely, let's moving on to the expenses on taxes and fees and things are astronomical in this region compared to what you will get in other regions that you will have. And obviously, it is just, every country itself is very closed in regards to its financial system. It's often owned by some extraordinary rich and powerful people in those countries.
Right.
But that is something that has to change eventually. There's a lot of people getting into the market. And you obviously, there's some bit of movement at the moment in regards to microfinancing for those that can't simply get approved for bank loans because they don't have the different. Right. There's a lot of microfinancing sort of companies out there. There's also a lot of those money transfer companies as well in the market now, so you can try and move money and things around. So there is some progress, but here's a perfect example. There's a money transfer system called AFEX, which is quite big out of the US, and they operate across the region. But if you send money from AFEX into Panama and send it to the national bank, they won't accept it because they will only accept it from a bank. So that's just a simple example. Wow. Across the region, there has to be improvement within the financial services.
As we wrap up, I have one question that I'd be very interested in, and you're sort of implicitly hitting on it. Is as Nathan from Magma mentioned, hey, I'm surprised there isn't company building X. Where do you think are some big opportunities? You mentioned, for instance, there is no Amazon sort of throughout the region. The proxy is Mercado Libre, which is a bit different and about 80% less efficient. What are the things when you sort of look at the region, you just scratch your head and you say, man, there's such a big opportunity here. How's no one exploiting this in a major way?
Look, financial technology,
fintech
is a huge one. Simply everything at the moment is too slow and costs too much and is not accessible by a significant parts of the population. I don't know what exact numbers are off the top of my head, but there's a significant large portion of the population in the region that don't have bank accounts and never will get them open.
Right.
So I see across that sector a lot of opportunity. Another one is with respect to, employment. At the moment, when you hire, and this is more, more government needs to do something about it, is when you hire an employee in some of these countries, you might give $1 to the employee, but it will actually cost the company $1.75, for example.
Right.
But the employee actually only gets 70 cents. So at the moment, what's happening is a company's paying $1.75, the employee is getting 70 cents. And yes, all the rest of it goes to benefits and other things, etc., which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I do think there's an opportunity somewhere within that to operate more efficiently with government, etc., to get more value to the employee who's getting more money in their hand to, stimulate the economy and everything else. So there's definitely something within that. Don't quite know what it is yet, but around that, I suspect there is. And I guess the last one is a very simple thing, and this is if you're not smart enough, and people like me aren't, to come up with a good idea, just take one that works somewhere else in the world and bring it here. Right. In the end of the day, that's, franchises are a perfect example, these sorts of things. At the end of the day, I have, quite a successful law accounting firm. At the end of the day, I didn't come up with that. I guess the closest thing I did together was join them together. But the reality is, there are a lot of things that make your life living in the US easy. And if you think about those things, and then think about this part of the region, there are those things, I just can't do that. So I want something, I just can't order it. And it's going to arrive. If I do, I'm going to pay an extra 60% on top. Well, clearly there's an inefficiency in their market there. There's an opportunity. And there's quite a lot of that. And obviously removing that, gets more bang for your buck, I guess.
Well, let me tell you, I'm thrilled to have met you, and I'm thrilled that, there are people like you doing the good work in LATAM, helping. Given the inherent challenges of doing business, I think it's great people like you are sort of helping international clients navigate how to, make what we used to call a soft landing into the region rather than, blow up on their initial landing. So I love what you're doing, and thank you so much for chatting with us.
No, look, it's an absolute pleasure. And whilst, I've talked about a lot of our different challenges in the region, etc., there's also a lot of opportunities. And that's, I'm a fairly positive person. And those people, or those companies considering looking at the region, has an enormous GDP, enormous population, opportunity. And I always encourage people to give it a go.
And in terms of if somebody wants to follow your social media or your blog posts, what are the best places to find you?
Look, the simple thing is if you just Google Biz Latin Hub, BizLatinHub.com, you will be able to find the website and all the different things associated with myself and the company and the group.
Well, that's great. Thanks again. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Este fue otro programa de Aquí y Ahora, auspiciado por PAG.law, especialista en Venture Capital. Hasta pronto.